Thank you so much for being here today, and I hope you've enjoyed the early morning session that we've had. But of course, we will continue to follow on with our great programming for the day. So we will have a PBS NewsHour featuring the collaborative effort in Cottage Grove, and then after that, we will turn it over to a panel. That panel will be led by Miss Kathy, and I joked with Kathy earlier, and when I mentioned this panel earlier, I made a joke and I told Kathy, I said, this will be a little hard for me. If you see her last name, it's Colville, and I am from Greensboro, North Carolina, and if you're from Greensboro, you understand that Ville is not Ville, it's Vol. That's how we pronounce it, as in Gibsonville, Reedsville, McLeansville, so it's Vol. So I'm going to try to pronounce. We're going to do Vol. So she's given me permission to say Kathy Colville. So that works for me and my East Greensboro pronunciation. So with that, I'll introduce Kathy Colville, who is the Director of Healthy Communities for Cone Health, one of North Carolina's largest and most comprehensive health networks, serving communities in Guilford, Forsyth, Rockingham, Alamance, Randolph, Caswell, and surrounding counties in more than 100 locations. Kathy leads Cone Health's effort to identify critical population health needs and engage key community partners to improve access to care and health outcomes for the most vulnerable to health inequities. She worked for almost a decade in public health emergency preparedness and hospital emergency management, including as a public health responder during Hurricane Wilma and hospital leader during the H1N1 flu pandemic. Kathy holds a bachelor's degree in comparative literature from Brown University and master's degrees in social work and public health, both from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She serves on numerous, okay, go ahead. She serves on numerous community boards and is currently pursuing a PhD in public administration from North Carolina State University. Kathy has an impressive resume, but the most important thing that I am supposed to address and articulate today from Brett and Carolyn is to be sure that you know that Kathy is a true community partner, and one of her most endearing attributes is she simply cannot be beat at tilting windmills. So we will have our video, and then after that, we will lead directly into Kathy in this great panel.
All right, we're going to go ahead with our panel, and before I do that, I just want to share personally how important the Cottage Grove project has been to me. It's helped me to grow so much professionally, and it's given me a community of incredible advocates, many of whom are on the stage, but also here in the audience. So if you are connected to the Cottage Grove project, could you please stand and acknowledge your work? And that's so many of you. We want to acknowledge Beth McKee Huger, Community Foundation, please. Stephen Sills, so many people, Stephanie, Vaney, please, Vaney, thank you so much. I think we have Verna Torrain, we have Mary Webster here as well, so many people from the neighborhood. Thank you all. And Verna Torrain, Neighborhood Association President, is here as well. What an incredible group, and what a big lift. That this already accomplished so much and still rearing for more. So my instructions to our panelists in preparing for this event was to ask you all to give us the inside scoop. From your unique perspective, how does a community put a health and housing initiative together? And if you remember, I asked you for the blood, sweat, guts, tears, triumphs, challenges, all of it. This is a time for us to be real, because we want to convey both the difficulty and the promise and potential of putting projects like this together. I want to just let you folks know that these are the doers right here in front of you. These are the people who sweat the details to make the right people, the right agencies, the right money, and the politics of this all come together. And I'm just going to put in quotes, effortlessly, right? All tied up into 8 minutes on PBS NewsHour. Sel Bung is going to share her experience as a resident of Cottage Grove and a leader in its revitalization. Now, I'm just going to point out that we don't have many actual physical bridges in Greensboro except our highway overpasses, but we do have this amazing human bridge named Josie Williams, who will tell her story from the perspective of a community advocate and organizer. Brittany Kielhurn is the owner of Cottage Gardens, formerly Avalon Trace, and she's going to share her really interesting perspective as a business executive and a developer of distressed properties. And Brittany told me during the break that she's no fun at parties because all she wants to do is talk about affordable housing. And well, here she is, getting to talk about affordable housing. And I believe you were doing back of the envelope calculations of the A&T students' designs as well as they were up there. Can't stop figuring it out. I appreciate that. Melissa Monbouquette, I'm sorry, I've got you in the wrong order here, and Danielle Breslin. They are going to offer us a somewhat wider view of our state and our nation and the philanthropy perspective on projects that are moving upstream for health. So as you saw in the video, you saw a little bit of a snippet of the work in Cottage Grove. Community building and advocacy have been in process over the past 10 years or more in Cottage Grove. Some of you may remember even a decade ago the Cottage Grove Initiative. Then there was the sustained outreach of the City of Greensboro's Better Buildings program, and most recently there's a group that's come together under the umbrella of Collaborative Cottage Grove. And maybe that collaborative can claim to have been working together for 4 or 5 years at this point. That collaborative includes the Cottage Grove Neighborhood Association, the Friendly Neighborhood Watch Association, the Greensboro Housing Coalition, New Hope Community Development Group, Mustard Seed Community Health, the City of Greensboro, UNC Greensboro, the Guilford County Health Department and Cone Health, and many others. These agencies have been joined and assisted by many other organizations and individuals who are just drawn to authentic resident leadership and being a part of something positive. That has included investments from the BlueCross BlueShield North Carolina Foundation and the Build Health Challenge. You've seen in the video just one small glimpse of the work and the wonderful people committed to it, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the people up here working to make our community a healthier, homier place. Mpang is a Bonner Scholar and a senior at Guilford College majoring in community and justice studies, a minor in business and visual arts, which is a pretty cool mix of things to do. Before coming to the US, Sel's family were refugees in Cambodia, and she actually comes from a small village within one of the 5 Montagnard indigenous groups of Vietnam. She appreciates the diverse population in Cottage Grove, where there is a rich history and strong community ties. Sel is a community health worker for Collaborative Cottage Grove, and she advocates for community change to improve the quality of life. She is another one of our human bridges. She brings a wealth of life experiences, and she helps to bridge communication between different groups of people and increase community engagement. Sel believes in building communities from the ground up and creating healthy communities to increase equitable opportunities. Thank you so much. Josie Williams serves as Greensboro Housing Coalition's project coordinator for the Community-Centered Health Homes Initiative in Cottage Grove, in the neighborhood in Greensboro here. She's a graduate of Guilford College as well. She earned her bachelor's degree in community and justice studies. She engages neighborhood leaders and community agencies to implement policy, environmental, and systems change to promote healthy opportunities and access to decent and affordable housing. Using her past encounters with financial insecurity and homelessness as a guide, Josie respects and understands the deep challenges that low-income communities face as they seek to improve their quality of life. Her unique perspective allows her to function as a connector for the many individuals and organizations that seek an equitable process and equitable outcomes for community-engaged design and grassroots work. Brittany Kielhurn is the founder and CEO of Carolina Community Investments. This is a real estate development firm which purchases and renovates deeply distressed single and multifamily properties across North Carolina. She's a commercial general contractor, most recently partnered with the City of Greensboro, the Greensboro Housing Coalition, and a community development lender to restore a 60-year-old apartment complex, which is, of course, Cottage Gardens, formerly Avalon Trace. She graduated in 2007 from Duke University with degrees in international relations, economics, and markets and management. More recently, she completed an MBA from UNC Chapel Hill and began teaching urban economics at Duke, which maybe is your side hustle, is that right? Oh. All right, Danielle Breslin is the Vice President of the BlueCross and BlueShield of North Carolina Foundation. Danielle works closely with her team and the foundation board to develop strategies to improve medical and dental health outcomes for underserved populations and to increase physical activity and access to local healthy food. Danielle's responsible for overseeing all operational aspects of the foundation, including finances, data management, and policies and procedures. She was selected as one of the top 25 women in business by the Triangle Business Journal. She served on committees and boards for Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, the North Carolina Network of Grant Makers, Girl Scouts North Carolina Coastal Pines, Farmer Food Share, and the Southeastern Council of Foundations. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia and completed her certificate in nonprofit management from Duke University. And Melissa, you're down there at the end, but we love you too. Program Officer at the Beaumont Foundation. In her role, Melissa provides grant management and technical assistance to a portfolio of grants focused on cross-sector collaboration, social determinants of health, and upstream approaches to health improvement and workforce development in the public health sector. She serves on the Executive Steering Committee and as coordinator of the Build Health Challenge, which is a national multi-funder initiative that supports multi-sector community-driven partnerships to reduce health disparities caused by inequity. She joined the de Beaumont Foundation in the fall of 2012. The foundation's mission is to strengthen and transform public health in the United States. Melissa came to de Beaumont from positions at the National Children's Museum, the Pew Research Center, Tufts University, and the Prado Museum in Spain. She's a graduate of Tufts University. So I'm going to start with you, Sel. I'm going to ask you to tell us, as a resident of Cottage Grove and a leader in its revitalization, help somebody who's never been to Cottage Grove to understand, what is Cottage Grove like? What do you and your neighbors like about it, and what have you been doing to work to improve the neighborhood?
Awesome. So I've been in Cottage Grove for almost 11 years now. In the community, I was very involved in that I would walk to Dudley every morning. I went to Dudley High School and walked there every morning, and even over the summer, I would walk up there for band camp and come back. And you know, that's how I built my community in the initial stage. And then I got to college, and then it was like my sophomore year, going into my sophomore year, and Andrew introduced me to Josie. And you know, through Josie, I made all these networks with the collaborative and like built this community that even though I was in the physical community, I wasn't involved in the capacity that I am in now. And so my family have been living in the house for 10 years, and never did we interact with our other neighbors, except for the ones who were across from us, of course. We had a gentleman that would give my dad seeds to plant outside the house. And so we were building relationships only around the people that we knew, and that was like the Monsignor community. They had about 5 Monsignor families with habitat homes that they built on McConnell Road. So that was our first set of communities. And when I became a community health worker, that's when I met Verna Terrain, and you know, I was going to the meetings on Tuesdays, and you know, trying to get my parents to be to join in on the community activities. They at first didn't feel comfortable, especially as refugees. We feel as though a lot of events or like community events aren't made for us because there's a language and a cultural barrier. But kind of like breaking that with my family, it also taught me how to break that with the Burmese community and other refugee and immigrant communities who do feel like they can't get out of their homes and into the communities. And then also just like the built environment is not suitable to allow people to feel comfortable or to like interact with each other. There's really no space for that. So a lot of people are isolated, and especially with refugees coming here, you know, their community is only within Avalon Trace, because that's where they've resettled the refugees. And so kind of working around that and getting them involved in the community, and you know, building that bridge for them to, you know, see Dr. Beth, and to you know, reach out to the Greensboro Housing Coalition and other like collaborative partners for different resources, and building that community. So that's like my look into Cottage Grove, and it's really like built because I've also worked with my neighbors, and they're also patients as well with Mustard Seed Clinic. And when I was on the health outreach team, we would make home visits, and some days when I wasn't working, it was just a weekend, we would just say hello and update each other, and yeah, it's been amazing to have that community.
So it's a lot of personal connections,
Yeah.
right? And just having the space to be together, and then getting connected to a super connector like Josie, and to an institution like Mustard Seed Community Health that's helping to really form that social connectivity between neighbors. How exciting. So I'm going to ask you, Sel, to just talk a little bit about some of the things that we think about when we think about Cottage Grove is residents like Verna Touraine and others that are here, like yourself, who are taking a leadership role in putting this together. But sometimes those projects, it's really just window dressing. It's really about a funder. It's really about an outsider. So can you help us to understand, is Cottage Grove, are the residents really authentically leading in Cottage Grove? And if so, why do you think that's true? What would set Cottage Grove apart in that aspect?
Yeah, so I actually read through some of your questions earlier this week, and I was like, how will I like phrase that in a way that makes sense for everyone? And I can't help but think about food. Of course, I'm a cook on the side, and so a lot of us have probably seen like cooking channels where they make cakes, and they're these like just extravagant and like beautiful cakes with fondant and just beautiful little crystals that are actually edible, and you're like, wow, I can eat that. And it's amazing. And I think when we go to different conferences like I have, and like going to different places, you see a lot of people talk about their projects, and it's like this amazing cake, and you're like, wow, that's like amazing, how's that even possible, you know? But does the cake taste good? I always wonder that. I always wonder that as a foodie. But my biggest thing is with Cottage Grove, it's not just how the cake looks. I think it looks really good, but it also tastes good. Because the thing about the resident involvement in Cottage Grove is that their experiences are validated, and that they're being heard, and you know, they're not being left on the side, you know, and decisions are being made here and like, oh hey, this is a decision that was being made. It's very authentic, and there's sharing of power. And I think that is very important in Cottage Grove that I don't see anywhere else, is that when I see like leaders like Josie herself, she's giving people so much room and space to grow. And I'm that person myself. She's giving me so much leverage and have connected me to so many resources and internships and so much more. And I think I've matured a lot in my role as a community health worker, as a resident, and as a student. And just knowing that these people in your communities do exist, and just validating people's experience. And people have an analysis of the world, and they understand their condition. They just need that support to even making it more noticeable, like the video that we just saw. That has been happening for many, many years, you know, housing issues in that community. I think it is now that we're validating them and really believing in them. And I think that's the most important thing about Cottage Grove and why it's like so authentic working there. And I hope that made sense.
It's a fantastic metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah.
You really did a great job. I think I get dazzled by the cakes as well. And but man, it really tastes good in Cottage Grove, doesn't it, Josie? I'm going to ask you to continue on in that vein. You do so much to amplify and foster the voice of the neighborhood in the neighborhood improvement. And I think in Cottage Grove, I think we really believe that the people who are going to change Cottage Grove are the people who belong to Cottage Grove. I want you to tell us what that looks like in practice. How do you bake that cake, make it taste good, and why that matters?
So, is this?
It will be on.
Okay.
They're masters over there.
What it looks like is, it looks like, and it is, residents actively engaged in every facet of the work that we do. I won't even engage with a university partner unless I have the residents with me from the beginning. So if a university partner wants to come in and do research in Cottage Grove, my thing is you need to come sit down with the residents because it's not, that's their community. So you want them involved from the beginning, at the front end, not on the tail end. And I think that the way that is baked in is just understanding that simple premise. At the essence of what we do, everybody in this room is coming together because ultimately they have a vision to create change and they want to support that change. But at the same time, we are working in communities where many have felt for so long that their voice did not matter. So why engage on any level without having their voice at the front end and sitting at the table with you? So that's why we have resident leaders. That's why when Andrew introduced me to SAIL, although she was like, I don't know, I don't have any experience, and she was really nervous, I was like, you'll be fine, come on, I'll go with you. So we'll canvas together, it'll be great. And so just looking at the fact that each person in these communities, I know there's sometimes a negative narrative that goes along with low-income communities, but those individuals are assets in those communities. And then you'll find the SAILs, and you'll find the Verna Terrains, and you'll find the ones that will get behind community change and community design and lead the other residents in the way. So we bake it in by fostering that type of engagement, and then the residents kind of set the momentum.
And I want to underline something you said, Josie, reminded me of you, Sal, saying people in the neighborhood have an analysis. You know, even the kids, right? And to unlock that and to understand that voice is the way to get to the solutions that last, right? Now, sometimes you do need someone from the outside, and sometimes you're lucky enough to find someone like Brittany. I got ahead of myself, though. I want to come back to Sel and Josie because I want to talk about the tornado. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the day. The tornado that came through Cottage Grove, other areas of East Greensboro, basically completely eliminated the elementary school in Cottage Grove. I wanted to talk about, if you can just portray for people the days in the immediate aftermath of the tornado, and how this Cottage Grove collaborative and an organized presence in the neighborhood made a difference to that neighborhood.
That was, I still vividly remember getting the phone call, and it was interesting that I had just left from over there, and I was working with the resident leader, and I had just left her home, and my husband gets in the car, he shuts the door, and the rain comes down. And I joked with him, and I said, baby, you brought the rain. He shut the door, and the rain just came down, and we were leaving out of the path, going home, and while it was coming in, and we didn't know it was a tornado. It was just treacherous rains and winds and things. And so I get home 15 minutes later, and I'm getting a phone call from my other community health worker. And she called, and she's in a state of panic. And she was walking around like in a delirious state, and she was just screaming on the phone, and she was like, oh my God, Hampton's gone, and everything's just messed up. And she was like, you gotta get back over here. And I was like, I just left. And she couldn't calm down, and I had to hang up the phone, and I got dressed again. We came in the neighborhood, and I could not get in. It was like a war zone. And we had to park down on East Market and walk up several blocks to get into the neighborhood. And whereas English Street is just a walk down, 5 minutes, it took me 20 minutes to get to Apache Street, and Apache Street was blocked off, and people were just walking around in a delirium, and it was just very devastating to see. And I could not think of, what are we gonna do in the morning? And so I get home at 11 o'clock at night, I draft an email, and if I'm not mistaken, I sent the email at like 11 o'clock and then sent it again the next morning. And I sent it to our collaborative Cottage Grove network, which is our partners, and the funders was on that email, and I added anyone else that I could think of. And the email just stated, our community has been devastated. And I just started describing what I knew in a very quick paragraph, and I said I would send an update soon. Many of the residents that we work with and those that you know and love are probably going to be displaced. And I was like, displacement is going to happen. And I shot that email out. And me and Brett get over back to my office in the community, and we're sitting down. And I remember the look on Brett's face, and he looked at me, he was like, what are we going to do? And the only other thing that I knew again was send out another email to that collaborative network, because we were already organized in that sense. And that was that morning, and by I think by 10:30, you called. Parks and Rec called. Can you believe Parks and Rec was the first ones to bring cases of water? And I love Phil Fleischman to this day. I always love him, but to see that water come in, it was just wonderful. But the fact that Parks and Rec came, the fact that Cone called, one of your colleagues came with like a dune buggy because you couldn't get through the neighborhood, so you couldn't drive down the streets, but one of those big three-wheelers or dune buggy things.
Ex-husband's dune buggy. How
Yeah,
about that?
he was driving over trees and things. Yeah, he was driving over trees and things, and that was around noonish. And then by early afternoon, we had like 100 volunteers. Unknowing to me that my email was being disseminated out to the network across the city and just different people. It even got through to our funders, so they were sending things out. And that was the first day. The second day, we didn't have 100 volunteers. We had 300 volunteers. And by the third day, the police department, I was walking up the street and we were canvassing and assessing needs, and somebody said, "Who's running this operation?" And and then like 10 people were like, and I didn't know why they were doing that. And I walked up and I was like, "Is something wrong?" He was like, "We got to shut English Street down." So there were thousands of people that had mobilized in 3 days, and English Street was shut down. And so that collaborative network, it started with one case of water from one partner. It started with someone, Kathy Collins, saying, "What do you need?" It started with Brett saying, "I'm gonna use the credit card for GHC and start going getting tarps," because there was just nothing there. It started with somebody having the idea of, Parks and Rec mentioned, "You're gonna need a generator," and then they brought generators, and somebody said, "We have no power, somebody's gonna need cell phones," and somebody brought generators, and then drop cords and everything. And I left to go canvassing. I came back 2 hours later, and my little office is a 600 square foot home in the community, and it was full of volunteers and all this stuff. And then we got so mobilized that we began to work really closely with the city of Greensboro. And so we were sending out organizers and volunteers to Phillips Avenue, that was hit really hard, that area, and then Florida Street, that was hit really hard. And it became almost like this one-stop shop of disseminating information and getting volunteers out to different areas across the city. And it was almost like the heavens had opened up and smiled on us. And I don't think that if we didn't have that kind of network, residents will tell you, and they are here. I've heard residents say, "I don't know what would have happened," but they don't think we would have survived that. And it was very fortunate in our area, no one was killed. But the fact that we found out that people were finding people up under trees and debris and had been there for 24 hours and lived, and it was residents finding other residents in the community just from us going out and doing walking. And we did that for week after week after week. And just to see that, it just showed the strength of the community. And when a community is organized and when you have the support, anything is possible. And I mean, so when someone says something can't be done, I can't stand to hear that because to have the evidence of what can be done when one voice comes together.
You've depicted a resilient community, and the fact is, it's a traumatic experience to lose your home or not lose your home, but live in a community that's been affected by tornado, and the mental health recovery that you get from going outside and seeing that there's people here, that it's still my neighborhood, that it's insiders and outsiders, that we're helping each other. That's a huge piece of community response and community recovery. The description that you gave at the end of creativity and people coming together, I think this is a fantastic way to talk about the project that Brittany has spearheaded. You bought a rundown apartment complex with a very high vacancy rate. It's something that most traditional lenders would not touch, Brittany. And I'm gonna ask you guys to start the slides. There's some slides that Brittany brought that show Avalon Trace and then the new cottage gardens as well. I'm just gonna ask you to talk with our group about why you were attracted to the project and what is the economic model for doing a project like this?
Sure. So we got the questions in advance, so I thought about this a lot, and even so, I think I have 6 words written down on a piece of paper, because I really wanted to give honest answers here.
Yeah.
By the time I graduated from college, I had lived in 22 different places, 7 different towns, 3 different states. My mom was an entrepreneur, but not very successful, which meant that whenever we were screened to live in a new place, we would have to sort of negotiate. I actually grew up moving into places that we were painting and we were repairing and we were doing things because we were finding landlords who would sort of overlook my mother's financial history in exchange for us taking care of her apartment or us taking care of the landlord's property. So I have a very strong lived experience of living in some not very great places, of moving around a lot, of failing to form communities, partially because I was changing schools and I was changing locations, trying to figure out sort of a familial economic stability. In the meantime, my mom prized education. She made a really big point of making sure that I went to good schools, went to a good university, was set up for a good career. So went to school, studied economics. Of course, that sort of forces you into a job that looks for people who have studied economics, so ended up in the financial industry for about 10 years. But the thing that attracts me to a project like this, first and foremost, and it's the one word that I wrote down for this answer, is impact. Being able to do something with my skills that also allows for a positive community change, positive social change, positive economic change. It's what I think a lot of the people who come to events like this are looking for, because everyone's taking this day to come here and talk about solutions for problems like this, and problems like this are large. I very quickly asked Brett right before I came up, how many affordable units does the state of North Carolina produce a year? Subsidized affordable units. And neither one of us knew exactly, but I'm pretty sure the number is in the 4 figures, not 5. Mm-hmm. In a state of about 8 million people. Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in Greensboro alone, I think the number of people who need affordable units measures in the tens of thousands, who don't have them, rather, who need them. I come from Durham, so I have spent a number of years in Durham purchasing and renovating properties. Durham is having a lot of similar challenges to Greensboro, different in many ways, because all of a sudden the prices have, in some cases, doubled and tripled, and people can't find a place to live. Greensboro has a lot of distressed properties. Greensboro and the General Triad, I think a lot of people are from High Point, Winston as well. There's a lot of properties that have gotten so inexpensive, so run down, that people are just sort of ready to walk away. And there's an interesting economic model for that, to your question. And I joke all the time. I have an old Soviet propaganda poster hanging up in my office that says 2 + 2 + the enthusiasm of the workforce = 5. And that's a part of it. If you don't have an interest in the impact side of the business, not a lot of developers want to do something like this unless they care about doing it, because it's a brutal amount of work. It's a brutal amount of risk. Mm-hmm. It's spending and spending and spending and spending until the point that you can get to something like that. A lot of really bad landlords don't come into the business thinking, you know what I want to be when I grow up? A slumlord. Right? And it's really easy to demonize people now when you see, oh, these terrible landlords and these terrible conditions, and they're making all of this money. And I'm sure there's tons of people that's the case. I know them in Durham. I've heard of many of them in Greensboro. That's excellent. There's also a lot of landlords who own very low-priced rentals who are struggling to try to figure out how to not be that, how to not have that be the lived experience of their residents, while at the same time charging a price that is going to make it possible for them to not spend 80-90% of what they take home on their rent. If you make minimum wage, you bring home less than $1,000 a month. We're talking even about the students that were up here before, housing $650 to $850 per month. What do you do if you're living on minimum wage, spending that amount of money? You're just poor, and you stay poor. And the tire goes on your car, or your kid gets sick, and then you're in a lot of trouble. And subsidies don't fill that gap because there's just not enough of them. So the economic model for a project like this is really interesting, and I hope that partnerships like this can continue to form in other places, because we're not going to build the affordable housing that we need, not in Greensboro, not in North Carolina, not in the United States. It remains a pretty critical social issue because we have millions of people who are living in poor quality housing or without housing or putting most of what they make into their housing. And the challenge, of course, which a few people have already mentioned, it to a very big degree comes down to money. Both with respect to donations, of course, charitable donations, but somebody before said, how many of you have $1,000, $2,000 for a surprise expense? And not very many people, or plenty of people in this room I'm sure do, but a lot of people don't. Most people don't. So how many people in this room have $2,000 they can write a check for a charitable donation? Many of you, yes. But a lot more of you probably have $1,000 or $2,000 to invest in something. You have retirement accounts, you have investment accounts, and you say to yourself, how can I take the money that I have, take the capital that I have, and not give it away, because I can't give it away. I need to retire, I need to send my kids to college, I need to have something for myself, but I also want that money to be able to have a positive impact on my community and on the world. Balancing that is what I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to figure out, and imperfectly, I will be the first to say. Many people, I'm sure, have this similar experience, that it feels like herding cats to do my job. But the more people who say, okay, how can I figure out how to find an investment that's also going to be positive for the world, the more opportunities like this can exist. So this partnership, I as the developer was able to secure funding from what's called a community development finance institution. Basically what this group does is give loans to projects which have both solid economic models, but also some sort of positive impact as well. That group allows the interest rate that they charge to be a lot lower than perhaps the normal market rate, because there is that extra component of it where they're trying to also have impact. So to get into some of the nuts and bolts, that lender can perhaps lend in the 5 to 6.5% range, where the second best opportunity that I could find looking for debt on a property like this was going to cost me about 13%. And that's normal. I parlayed some of this into a project for graduate school. So I met with a lot of people who were sort of trying to steer portions of it, and they laughed when I talked about getting debt on a project like this, because it's not considered an asset. When you go out and get a mortgage, the reason you can get a mortgage is because your house is collateral. That property, Avalon Trace in its prior form, isn't collateral to a lot of lenders because they don't want to own it if I fail. Mm-hmm. And by the way, these projects require personal guarantees, which means not only do they take the project, which they don't really want the property in that condition, they get everything else that I have if it doesn't work. So finding a lender who's able to say, okay, you know what, I see what this is going to do for this community. I see how this can be a positive, impactful project, and I'm going to give you the money for it. That becomes a really important piece. Second, the city of Greensboro. Across North Carolina, I've spoken with a lot of the larger municipalities about what they do and don't do. Greensboro is really innovative in the fact that they have a lot of capital in lending programs that they can give to developers at a very low interest rate, which allows them to do targeted repairs. So I think the funds from Greensboro that I'm using are for energy efficiency in particular, which means that a lot of the retrofits that I'm doing with things like windows, things like heating and air, things like plumbing fixtures, is coming from a low interest loan from the city. That's important because interest by itself on a project like this could cost tens of thousands of dollars per month. So having that opportunity and continuing to support that opportunity as a community, I think, is really important to help developers make projects like this work. The third piece was the Greensboro Housing Coalition, which was able to provide a grant for repairs to a lot of the occupied units. That became really important, especially at the beginning, because the day that I took over, although the seller had said the property was 70% occupied, As the dust settled, I think it turned out to be closer to 33. Because surprise. Yeah, no, exactly. Which is great. And was very exciting to deal with over the past year. But it made no money at all for a really long time. It's still, I mean, I spend today twice as much on a monthly basis on repairs as I do, as I collect and rent. And that'll hopefully get better over time, and that's the whole point of the game, right? But in the meantime, the initial support from the Greensboro Housing Coalition helping fill that gap, which, by the way, the difference between the two amounted to about $25,000 a month whole in the project budget from rents that weren't being collected, which if you take that out over a year is a terrifying amount of money. So that became really important, especially from the get-go, getting those funds moving quickly, getting those funds into the project quickly. The seller had gotten himself in so much financial distress, he had stopped collecting the trash by the time I took over. I actually took a little bit of a leap of faith and started paying for trash collection almost a month before I actually bought the property, because no one else was going to do it, and it was piling up and causing all sorts of problems for everybody. But stuff like that is expensive, you know, and it's again, that's what it looked like. We have a monitor down here if you can't tell. That's what it looks like now, but it still. The challenge, of course, becomes from an economic model perspective that unless you have subsidy or unless you have some very creative financing or partners, you cannot build anything that you can then rent affordably, like point blank. My back of the envelope calculation that I was looking at, you know, if you're spending $125,000, $150,000 to build an apartment that you rent for $650 to $850, your return, I have my numbers right here, between 2.86 and 4.49% is my calculation. Might be a little bit off. Everyone does it a little bit differently, but that's tough. That's tough to ask someone to make an investment where if everything goes the way you expect it's going to, you're going to make 4.5%, which again is why the economic impact investment side of things becomes important, and getting the cost of borrowing in particular down so that project developers are able to get into this sort of thing. Because it can't just be charity, because there's not enough charitable dollars in the world to solve the problem, and it has to be a partnership between for-profit businesses, lenders, as well as community partners like yourselves. So.
Thank you so much, Brittany. And I'm thinking, yeah, appreciate that. And Jerome, I was channeling you during this. She's tough, isn't she? Yeah. I really appreciate your perspective, and I know it was important to you to be honest about exactly what goes into this, and that's really important information for us to carry with us. I'm going to move on to Danielle, and just thank you for your long-term investment from BlueCross BlueShield Foundation in the Cottage Grove community. You have been working with Cottage Grove since early 2015. And now working with the collaborative and community on sustainability of the model for community-centered health. I wanted to ask you what you've learned from working with Cottage Grove from your perspective as a funder. And you have worked on similar projects in other communities. What are the elements of success for a project like this, where you were investing upstream for health outcomes?
Well, great, thank you. So what I first want to say is, you know, the foundation at BlueCross, I mean, we have a pretty specific way that we've created this container that we call community-centered health, and I think, you know, you'll hear variations of it in different places, but the three elements that we were really looking for when we started this initiative were having that strong partnership between community and healthcare. That was like paramount, with true shared decision-making, and I think we've heard some of the authenticity in the community voice that is happening here in Greensboro. Also a focus on changing policies, systems, and the environment. So really recognizing that you have to have those longer term systemic changes happening in order to truly make that sustainable difference. And then finally, a clinical shift and a real change in the way that healthcare is thinking about things. And for us as a foundation, I mean, this was truly a new way to think about doing our work. When we think about Cottage Grove, I mean, I really feel like we hit the jackpot with having this community be one of the first 3 that we invested in. We've gone on to invest in 6 more. So we have 9 communities across North Carolina that are sort of embodying this model. But Josie and the team that she has put together here in Cottage Grove is truly outstanding and has created great lessons learned for us as we continue to move forward in this work. I think when you think about that partnership between community and healthcare, when they first applied, they had 4 partners around the table. Now it's probably 9 and growing, and it's your traditional kind of nonprofit community-based organizations, but then you do have the health system, you have city leaders, universities, community members. I mean, all the people that are represented here in this room really stepping up and being part of this partnership. The community truly leading and being part of that decision-making process. I mean, you saw in the video, Josie leading those community resident sessions. And, before she would say, well, maybe we'd get sort of like 6 people kind of showing up sporadically. And now attendance is, 30 plus on a monthly basis because the residents are realizing that their voices are important and that matters. And so really having that resident-led piece is critical to this. And that has been a real learning point for us as a foundation and a real shift in how we're doing our work, because we really had to learn how to work differently to be able to support our grantees in truly hearing from community, and the time that it takes to do that was really important. And so a lot of this work focuses not only on the grant dollars, which we get are important, but on the coaching and the technical assistance that goes along with it. So really working hand in hand and knowing that it's going to take time. I think with regard to the focus on the changes in policies and systems and environments, I mean, if you look at Cottage Grove now, the environment relative to where it was back when we started, and again, you mentioned, Kathy, the blood, sweat, and tears. Like, these are the folks putting in the blood, sweat, and tears. So I just need to acknowledge that. I mean, where I sit, it's a very different type of support that we're giving. And I realize it's an important part of this ecosystem, but it is definitely not the same. And when you drive around, and Kathy sent us a picture, which we so appreciate because we don't live here in this community. And she snapped this photo one day of someone riding their bicycle down South English Street, I think it was, and saying, like, look, like, we built it and they came, like, they're using the bike lanes. And that's a tangible difference in a community, seeing community gardens, seeing new playgrounds. Those are changes that are here for the long term in this community, and I think that is just an awesome change. And then, probably the most important piece for us, and I think really where there's a lot of potential and where the rest of this day is going to continue to focus on, is getting healthcare to think differently. That is such a big piece of this, because unlocking those dollars, in addition to some of the investment dollars, I mean, that's where we really have a lot of potential to make a big difference. And we are seeing those changes here. I mean, you all have amazing partners in Cone Health, and the way that they are just coming to the table and thinking differently, looking to change their EMR so that they can start making those referrals for housing remediation and assistance needs. Having Dr. Beth and Kathy talk with the Minimum Housing Standards Commission about rules and regulations, having healthcare play that type of part, having having CEL and others in the community being community health workers, and really having that opportunity for people in the community to engage in that healthcare way, I think is just a really big and important part.
Yeah. And Danielle, were you getting ready to say something else?
No, you can go ahead.
I do want to say that what we heard through the grapevine was that this was a risky investment for BlueCross BlueShield as well. And you had to walk with us through, is this going to turn into anything, right? So we want to appreciate a funder that allows a community to germinate, that allows that community and resident engagement and those connections, and understands that that's the work as well. So that was such a critical part of the development of Cottage Grove. And I think it took vision as a philanthropist to be willing to take that risk with the communities.
And I think the big part for us too was working with our board and getting them to understand that the wins for us are gonna look really different in a project like this than maybe the wins for some of our more traditional grant making. And so things that we see that are really important is when the community is recognized as the expert in what they need and how to actually solve the issues that they're facing. And so not coming in feeling like, well, not only do we have the money, but we have the answers for you. And for philanthropy as a whole, I mean, it's a different way of thinking. And I think that that has been a really important mindset shift. And then the last thing I'll say is, recognizing the power structures and the power dynamics, and that has been a real learning journey for us that we feel privileged to have gone on with the communities in terms of recognizing that you can't just start to address these issues without addressing the underlying systemic injustices that are prevalent, particularly in places in the South and very much so here in North Carolina. And that's why it takes so long. But you have to kind of stick with it, and you have to go through a lot of tough things. And we, again, as a foundation team, have really started to think differently and are trying to learn as best we can alongside our partners. And I think having partners like Josie has just been tremendous for us as an organization, for me as an individual, and just delighted to see the changes happening here in Greensboro, and hope that what's happening in Cottage Grove is catching on, and that other communities and other neighborhoods are saying, hey, we want that for our neighborhood, and what can continue to happen, spreading it out. Just, it's going to take neighborhood by neighborhood to make the changes.
Absolutely. We're going to look to Melissa. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that, Tara. Isn't that a great, we need to raise up philanthropy that's thinking in this way. It's wonderful. Melissa, we're going to look to you for a little bit of a national perspective. The Beaumont Foundation is in Maryland, but you work across the country trying to support, as we said, to support, promote, and transform public health. So when you're hearing about a project like Cottage Grove, is this what we should be thinking about? Is this public health? How do you think this work represents transformation, both for healthcare and for public health?
Yeah, so I think my foundation is very focused on public health, governmental public health, but also how it happens in communities and what works, what doesn't, how we can be better at making sure the health of our communities is improving every day, and not moving the conversation from healthcare and treatment of health issues that have come up to prevention and health as a holistic concept. Like, what is the quality of your life, and addressing those issues before you land in a doctor's office. And I think over the last few years, there's been a shift in the way public health thinks about that. As you get more chronic diseases, asthma and diabetes, other things, you can't treat those in a doctor's office. There is no pill that solves asthma. There are things that can address the symptoms, but what you really need to do is go in and address the environment that people are living in. And public health has known that for a long time, and what I think has been the shift in the field is to start to move to build those partnerships, to bring in the others that can help make those changes, because public health can't do that alone. And what I think has been really exciting is that the healthcare system and the housing partners and the other sectors are seeing that and getting that. They understand it. I think, I've been working on the Build Health Challenge now for about 5 years, and Build is an amazing program. We've funded 37 communities around the country. We have now 11 funding partners, including BlueCross, BlueShield, North Carolina. And we're about to launch, where we have a new call for applications out for 18 more communities that will get 2 more years of funding.
And will you tell us what the letters in BUILD stand for?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So BUILD is an acronym. It stands for Bold, Upstream, Integrated, Local, and Data-Driven. And those are our 5 pillars of how we think communities can address health and improve their health. And so one thing I think is interesting about BUILD, it is issue agnostic. We don't care. We think communities know best what they need, whether it's housing, whether it's food access, whether it's transportation or education issues, whether it's criminal justice reform. And so we let the communities tell us as funders, like, hey, this is what we need to work on. These are the partners we need to have at the table. Every BUILD partnership has a community-based organization, a healthcare system, and a public health department working together, but many have many other partners and have brought together many others, and Greensboro is such a great example of this. But I think it is going to be a shift for healthcare too, because, for example, our Des Moines site, which is working on housing, and housing bubbles up a lot. It is something it is easy to understand how it impacts health. Some of the others are a lot more challenging to make that link and to see the immediate change. But for example, in Des Moines, they were working on housing remediation referrals, much as will be happening here. And they had a 3-year-old boy who had had $85,000 worth of hospitalization bills over the past year for asthma. Des Moines went in, and the Des Moines team went in and repaired the roof, pulled up the carpets, did some education with the family. That cost about $8,500, and that 3-year-old boy has not been back to the hospital. And so that's such a no-brainer for why hospitals and payers would want to do this kind of work, because at the end of the day, those are the people that's the way health improves. And those, you don't want people in your ER. You don't want people who are high utilizers and super users of that emergency room. I mean, that's a nightmare.
Well, think of the suffering of that family.
Yeah.
$85,000 worth of hospital bills.
Right, and community members, of course, that's the worst thing to see your child hospitalized. And so I think that's where these partnerships make so much sense. But what I think is also really cool about Build is that the upstream piece, and it's not just treating, I think you have to address those issues. You have to go in and say, this child is getting sick, let's address the thing that's making him sick. But I think it's also figuring out, how can we prevent people from getting to that point in the first place, from getting to the hospital in the first place. And I think Build has some great examples of that in Cleveland, which is also working on health and housing issues. They started off doing remediations, and now they're sharing all their data as a team with each other and putting it in a de-identified way. Like, it's very complex and it's super hard. These partnerships are challenging. But they're putting it into an app so that residents in Cleveland, in this neighborhood in Cleveland, can make decisions on where they want to live based on how it might impact their family's health. They don't have to live in unhealthy housing. It is harder to find quality, inexpensive housing, of course. But if you can have access to that information, maybe you can make decisions that you wouldn't have been able to make otherwise. And then I think in Washington, D.C., where I live, they are also working on housing, and they're a medical legal partnership. So they are referring tenants who are having chronic health issues related to their housing to the Children's Law Center in DC, and they'll go in and address these issues legally to make sure that landlords are addressing mold and other issues. But they've started partnering with the Attorney General, which is really cool, because they can start to go after some of the bad landlords and address whole buildings, not just because, honestly, if you've got mold in your apartment, probably your neighbor does too. And you can clean it up, but it's probably going to come back if your neighbor isn't also cleaning it up. So they've started working with the Attorney General to work on whole buildings that landlords own in DC. But what they're also doing is working with the city council, and they are going in to change the policies that impact housing, because what the end goal is, right, is to never have to have anyone live in unhealthy housing. The end goal is to eliminate that happening. And so there are tons of policies out there that can do that. There are the low impact loans that you mentioned. There are different, making sure in DC we have requirements that certain percent of new housing that gets built, and there's a lot of new housing in DC because it's a big growing city, has to be available for low-income renters. There are proactive rental inspections, which just happened in a city next to ours in Alexandria, so that rental units are getting inspected not when someone complains, but on a regular basis. And that's expensive. It's expensive for a city, but finding ways of financing those issues can really make a huge difference. And I will say, what I love about being here in Greensboro is the power of the community voice here. That is not true in all of our build sites, and just Josie's team and the way that you elevate the voice, I think, makes such a big difference. And I think, but if you can combine the community voice with a huge weight of the hospital voice and other big power players in your community, that can make such a difference in changing policy.
And that is what we intend to do.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think the point of policy is to not just help the people who are already sick, who are those living in extreme poverty or super users of the ER, but those who are more, I think Brittany addressed this a little bit earlier, but we use the acronym ALICE. It's Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. So those that are employed, that have jobs, that are working, but are maybe living paycheck to paycheck and are one bad car day, one health incident, one layoff away from losing everything, and becoming those people who become super users, becoming the people who are really in a bad place. And so the more you can address policy, it's a rising tide lifts all ships, right? So the more you can support those that are not only those who are most in dire need, which needs to happen too, but also those that may be in the near future, you can start to make these incredible changes in the community.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We've got our stop sign, so I'm going to close this. We have so much more work to do. I always think about that moment in the PBS NewsHour video where Josie's showing the reporter the pictures, and he says, "And people are paying rent for this?" And she says, "Yes." And that's happening right here in our community still. In other places, we still have so much more work to do, but we're figuring it out, and we've got a community that is committed, I think, to keeping to struggle against and push on these issues. Let's thank all of our panelists for their incredible work. They were amazing. All right, we have Ray and John. Ray?
Thank you so much. This was an excellent panel. You guys hit every note and talked about partnership and collaboration and the things that can move this issue forward. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Normally when you come to a summit or when you come to an all-day event such as this, the best part of the day is lunch. But to the credit to the panelists and the people that have been here today, we're going to speed through lunch because we have so much good information and such great conversations that have been going on, and we're going to continue through that. So before we get to lunch, we do have our fearless leader, Mayor Nancy Vaughn, with us. So we do want to give her a couple of seconds to address everyone before we move to lunch.
And I know I'm between you and lunch, so I will just be a few minutes. Today has been a very busy day in the city of Greensboro, and I know that you have already been welcomed by Yvonne Johnson, so I will be very brief. I do want to say thank you to the Housing Coalition for putting on this summit. It is sold out, and I think that says a lot for the city of Greensboro, how important it is that we know that housing is. And it is very important to your city council. And you talked a lot about policy, and policy is important. And we know that policy has to drive this discussion. And we know that the city of Greensboro was in the forefront of policy for many years, and that we had programs that really drove this state, and that many of those policies have been dismantled. And I can tell you that we are talking about trying to get those policies back in place with our legislature. And it is going to take all of us to make sure that we can get proactive inspections back in place, good proactive inspections back in place, so that we can have healthy homes, because we know that everybody needs healthy homes. We just had really good conversation on why healthy homes are important, you know, not only from a moral perspective, but from a business perspective. We know that for every argument, there is the moral case and there is the business case. And we just heard both perspectives right here. So they have given us the blueprint to have those discussions with our legislators. We have heard those discussions. Your city council, I think your county commissioners, your health department, we know those business cases and we have taken them to heart. So I hope that we can take these discussions and that we can bring them to the state, and we can say that we need good policy and procedures. So with your help, I think that we can bring it to the state and we can get those procedures in place. So I want to say thank you very much for being here today, because we know that you are investing your time and that there are other ways that you can invest your time, but housing and health is important for our community. And I want to say thank you for being part of this panel, because it is a very important topic for our city, because when we talk about the #1 crisis here in the city of Greensboro, and I do not use that word crisis in a, what would the word be?
Overly
Lightly.
dramatic. Yeah.
Crisis, it is. Housing is a crisis for us. And it is important that you are here and that we get this message out. So thank you for being here today. I know that I am in here between you and lunch, and I look forward to speaking to you here today, and I hope that we can move this message forward. Thank you very much.